Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Sleep Crime Stories, where real tales unfold in the calm of the night. If you're here to unwind, relax, or drift to sleep while listening to stories of mystery and quiet intrigue, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, let's begin tonight's story. A story about a man whose kindness and hard work earned him respect, but whose life was quietly unraveled by betrayal. This is the story of Bruce Miller, a Michigan businessman, a husband, and a victim of a crime born from deceit and hidden desires. So find a comfortable place to rest. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let's step back in time to a quiet corner of Flint, Michigan, where love, greed, and tragedy would intertwine in a way no one could have imagined. Brook Hollow was a town that could almost vanish from the map. Nestled between rolling hills and thick pine forests, it seemed untouched by the chaos of the outside world. A place where streets were quiet, neighbors waved politely in the morning, and every house had a story, whether told or whispered. On the surface, it was peaceful, perfect even, but as often happens, the quietest places sometimes conceal the darkest secrets. Claire Holmes arrived in early October, a young woman in her late 20s, seeking solace after years in a bustling city. The city had been noisy, relentless, demanding constant vigilance. Traffic lights, blaring horns, the constant hum of human life. It was exhausting. She had longed for simplicity, for a life where mornings smelled like dew and evenings were quiet enough to hear one's own heartbeat. Brook Hollow, with its gentle hills and autumnal glow, promised exactly that. The house she chose sat on Cedar Lane, at the edge of town. White siding, broad wooden porch, an old oak tree that leaned like a silent guardian against the roof. It had charm, yes, but also character. The creaks and sighs of the old wood spoke of decades of life, of storms weathered, of families grown and moved on. To Claire, it was perfect. And yet, something about the house seemed to watch. Her first night in the house was uneventful, or so she thought. As she unpacked, the wind rattled a loose shutter against the porch. She paused, listening. Faintly, almost imperceptibly, she heard a sound from upstairs, the soft scrape of a shoe on a wooden floor. She froze, straining her ears. The house was empty. She had checked every room, yet the sound returned, a slow rhythm that seemed deliberate. Claire told herself it was nothing. Old houses creak, floors settle. Perhaps an animal had wandered in. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the shadows cast by her lamp, she could feel a presence, not tangible, not loud, but lingering in the corners, in the spaces her eyes could not see. The next morning brought small anomalies. The front gate slightly ajar, though she was certain she had latched it. A garden gnome tipped over on the walkway, its painted face pressed against the ground. A curtain, which she had tied neatly the previous evening, hung limply in the morning light. Each incident was explainable alone, but together they hinted at something deliberate. Over the next few nights, the disturbances escalated subtly. Footsteps that seemed to echo in hallways where no one walked. Faint scratches against window panes, soft enough to be mistaken for wind. Lights flickering unexpectedly. Claire tried to rationalize each incident, but a creeping unease settled in her chest. A quiet, insistent pressure. One evening, she noticed a shadow in the abandoned lot next door. Dark coat, bent figure, moving slowly, observing. She froze, heart pounding, but the figure vanished almost immediately. The rustle of dry leaves was all that remained. That night sleep came fitfully, each creak amplified, every gust of wind a potential warning. Then came the note, slipped under her door, plain, chilling. I know what you saw. Claire's hands shook as she unfolded the paper. She replayed every moment from the past days, searching for what she might have seen, but nothing stood out. Or perhaps it was the things she had not noticed. The movement in the shadows, the silent observation from the lot, the faint sense of being followed. The days that followed brought subtle but deliberate harassment. Lights turned on in rooms she hadn't touched. Objects shifted ever so slightly. Keys she placed carefully on the hook were found on the floor, out of place. Every incident was minor, but the cumulative effect was suffocating. She began keeping a journal, documenting every event, no matter how small. Footsteps, shadows, notes, lights, the timing of noises, all carefully recorded. She began noticing patterns, certain nights, certain hours, certain rooms. Someone was meticulous, patient, watching not just her house, but her routines, her life. Neighbors began to notice changes in her behavior. Mrs. Ellsworth, the elderly woman 2 doors down, offered sympathetic smiles but avoided eye contact. Mr. Hayes at the cafe asked if she was sleeping well, and Claire could only give a polite, distracted nod. She felt both observed and isolated, a curious duality that amplified her anxiety. On a particularly windy night, the disturbances escalated further. She awoke to the sound of soft scraping along the hallway. Her heart raced. She rose slowly, flashlight in hand, careful not to make a sound. In the dim light, she noticed a chair shifted slightly. A kitchen drawer was open, though she had left it closed. She froze, listening. Faint breathing? Or was it only the wind through the cracks? Weeks passed, each day blending into the next with a slow, suffocating rhythm. Each night, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Footsteps outside, shadows moving across the yard, leaves rustling as if someone or something was creeping among them. Claire became hyper-aware. She noticed small changes in the lighting, in the angle of curtains, in the positions of furniture. Every detail mattered, every anomaly a potential clue. Then another note appeared. You're not alone. The handwriting was familiar from the first note, precise and deliberate. The message was simple, chilling in its clarity. Someone was inside her life, inside her home, watching, waiting. The realization settled over her like a cold fog. She was not merely a newcomer seeking peace. She was now a target, an unwitting participant in a slow, deliberate game. Claire began installing cameras, first small ones in corners, then more visible ones, hoping to capture even the faintest hint of the intruder. Every night became a vigil. She would sit quietly, notebook in hand, lights dim, recording every sound, every shadow, every twitch of the wind. The suspense grew like a living thing, pressing against the walls, pressing against her mind. She even began speaking softly to herself, narrating her own actions as if by verbalizing she could reclaim control. I'm safe. I'm careful. I notice everything. Yet the fear lingered, a slow burning ember that never fully died. The neighbors' curiosity grew. They began whispering about Claire, her solitary figure in the house, the faint lights late at night, her sudden cautious movements. No one asked directly, but a subtle tension wove through the town, hints of unspoken knowledge and half-remembered stories. Then came the first direct sign of intrusion. A small footprint on her porch, soft but clear in the dust. Not large, not heavy, but deliberate. Someone had been there while she was inside. Someone had been close enough to observe her movements, close enough to leave proof of their presence. Claire's nights grew longer, the shadows more distinct, the sound sharper. Every creak, every rustle, every distant whisper held potential significance. Her house, once a sanctuary, had become a stage for a slow psychological thriller, and at the center of it was her, the observer and the observed, caught in a delicate dance with an unseen presence. She realized something crucial. The disturbances were not random. They were orchestrated. Someone was patient, meticulous, deliberate, and this was only the beginning. The stage had been set. The town, quiet and unassuming, held secrets beneath its calm surface. The house, warm and inviting by day, held tension and shadows by night. And Claire, young, determined and cautious, was about to step fully into a story she had never asked for, a story that would test her courage, her wits, and her understanding of safety itself. And so we leave Claire at the threshold of discovery. The first disturbances have been noted, the first signs of menace observed. In the coming nights, the suspense will deepen. The notes, the shadows, the whispers, they will multiply, and the invisible watcher will become more deliberate, more daring. Claire will realize that her new life in Brook Hollow is far from ordinary, and the calm she sought may never fully return. The first week in Brook Hollow had already unsettled Claire. The notes, the shadows, the subtle intrusions had begun to chip away at her sense of safety. But it was the nights, long, quiet, endless, that gnawed at her the most. Every sound, every shift in light, every faint scratch became magnified. Claire began noticing patterns. Certain nights were worse than others. The wind seemed to carry more than air. It carried intention. Footsteps echoed in empty hallways. Objects shifted in ways that no breeze or animal could explain. The very walls of her home seemed to listen, to whisper warnings she could not fully decipher. One night, she awoke to a soft tapping at the window. Her pulse quickened. The sound repeated, soft, deliberate, patient. She approached slowly, flashlight in hand. The curtains rustled, but there was no one there, only the faint scratch of branches against glass. Yet the sense of being watched pressed down on her like a weight. She realized that her life had become a meticulous observation. She noted every anomaly in her journal, the time, the location, the nature of the disturbance, a misplaced key, a faint footprint, the subtle creak of a floorboard. Each detail mattered. Each could reveal the identity of the watcher or warn her of a deeper danger. The nights blurred together, each one bringing a new nuance. Footsteps in rooms she had already checked. Lights that flickered on and off in patterns she did not recognize. A shadow moving just beyond the porch light, vanishing the moment she blinked. Each incident was minor alone, but together they formed a language, a slow, deliberate code that only someone patient could create. Neighbors became a source of subtle tension. Mrs. Ellsworth, the elderly woman down the street, smiled politely, but her eyes betrayed knowledge. Mr. Hayes, who ran the small cafe, asked casual questions. "Sleeping well? All settled in?" But Claire noticed the hesitation in his voice, the way he looked away. There were whispers, half-hidden stories of Brook Hollow's past, of disappearances dismissed by authorities, of shadows that lingered too long. One evening, Claire found another note, carefully folded and tucked beneath her door. "I see you watching." The words were familiar, precise, deliberate. She pressed the paper to her chest, heart racing. Watching? She had not been looking at anyone. The thought chilled her. Had someone been inside while she was in the house, observing her from the shadows? Determined to gather evidence, Claire expanded her surveillance. Cameras went into corners, behind curtains, even outside the windows, facing the abandoned lot. She began to track times, locations, angles of disturbances. Every creak, every shadow, every movement was recorded, catalogued. Slowly, a map of activity emerged, a pattern, faint but undeniable. The disturbances themselves became more daring. One night, she awoke to the faint glow of a light in the hallway. Not her light. Someone or something was moving. She held her breath, listening to the soft shuffle of shoes, the deliberate tap of fingertips against wood. She grabbed her phone to record, but the movement vanished before she could press a button. Sleep became impossible. Claire's mind was alive in the night, analyzing every detail, replaying every anomaly. Her journal grew thick with notes. 10:32 p.m. Faint scratching at kitchen door. 11:07 p.m. Shadow, seen in living room, vanished before investigation. 1:15 a.m. Footsteps in upstairs hallway, soft, measured. She began talking to herself, whispering her own observations. I see you. I notice everything. I am careful. I am alert. The murmurs were a protective measure, a way to assert control over a world that seemed increasingly uncontrollable. Psychological tension began to seep into her daily life. Simple errands felt threatening. A glance from a neighbor, a passing figure on the street, a shadow in the corner of her eye. Each could be the watcher, each could be Keller. She became hyper-aware, cataloging movements outside her home as meticulously as inside. Subplots began to emerge. Claire spoke quietly with neighbors about her experiences, testing their reactions. Some smiled politely, as if humoring her. Others whispered warnings. Be careful at night. Some people in town, they're not as harmless as they seem. These minor characters enriched the story, adding layers of tension and atmosphere to Brook Hollow. One evening, a visitor, a delivery driver, noticed the cameras she had installed. He asked casually, Are you worried about break-ins? Claire replied carefully, masking the fear growing in her chest. Yet even in this mundane interaction, tension simmered. Every word, every pause could be interpreted as a signal. Every shadow outside was a potential threat. Another note appeared, slipped under the door with the same deliberate care. You cannot hide. This time, the writing felt more personal, more invasive. It was no longer a simple warning. It was a statement of control, a reminder of the intruder's patience and reach. Claire's journal entries grew longer, more detailed, reflecting her growing anxiety and determination. The shadow outside, fleeting but deliberate. The creaking floorboards, exactly at 2:13 a.m., as recorded by her camera. The rustle of leaves outside, timed with the soft tapping at her window. Days and nights bled together in a haze of observation, suspicion, and calculation. Claire began taking precautions, double-checking locks, sleeping with a flashlight at hand, moving through the house slowly and deliberately. She mapped every movement of the intruder she could detect, turning her home into a fortress of awareness. It was during one of these nights that Claire noticed something she had missed before. A small mark on the floor near the window, faint but deliberate. A footprint? A scuff? Evidence of someone's presence while she slept? She photographed it, noted it, and realized the intruder was not just cautious. He was precise, patient, and escalating. By now, the psychological tension was nearly unbearable. Every shadow, every sound, every flicker of light carried meaning. Claire's life had become a slow, measured dance of observation, deduction, and survival. The intruder had revealed himself not through force, but through patience, subtlety, and psychological control. And then the first real evidence of intentional intrusion appeared. A drawer in the kitchen, one she was certain she had left empty, contained a folded note. Not under the door, not slipped through a crack, but placed carefully where she would find it. It read, "Soon." The word was small, precise, and chilling. Someone was preparing for something, escalating toward a goal Claire could not yet see. Fear and determination mingled in her chest. She could no longer pretend these events were random. She had become part of a deliberate, calculated plan, one that would require her courage, intelligence, and vigilance to survive. Claire's nights continued in this pattern: observation, documentation, careful action, and subtle terror. She spoke to herself softly, narrating her movements, asserting control, trying to impose order on chaos. Each night, the shadow grew bolder, each note more deliberate, each sound more meaningful. Brook Hollow itself seemed complicit in the suspense. The quiet streets, the abandoned lot, the neighbors' careful glances, all contributed to the tension. The town's calm exterior masked layers of history, secrets, and unspoken knowledge. Claire, young and determined, had unwittingly stepped into a web of observation, manipulation, and slow-brewing psychological terror. And so, the stage was set. Claire, the watcher and the observed, had begun to uncover the patterns, the intrusions, and the deliberate mind orchestrating them. The suspense had grown from subtle sounds to tangible evidence. The watcher was patient, precise, and escalating. And Claire, armed with her journal, cameras, and determination, was about to step further into the heart of the mystery, toward discoveries that would change everything in Brook Hollow forever. Weeks had passed since Claire's arrival in Brook Hollow, and the disturbances in her home had grown more deliberate, more invasive. The notes, the shadows, the shifting objects, they no longer felt like random intrusions. Someone was orchestrating a careful, patient game, testing her limits. And now, the pattern was becoming clear. Claire had installed cameras, set up motion sensors, and meticulously logged every anomaly in her growing journal. Night after night, she observed faint figures moving through her yard, shadows flitting across the walls, and subtle signs that someone had been inside the house while she slept. Every trace was deliberate, precise, a hallmark of someone patient, calculating, and dangerous. It was during one quiet afternoon, speaking with her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Ellsworth, that Claire uncovered a fragment of truth. Mrs. Ellsworth, normally polite but distant, hesitated when asked about the abandoned lot next door. "There have been incidents before," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "People vanish quietly. Authorities don't always look closely. Most of us avoid speaking of it." Claire leaned in, her pulse quickening. She pressed gently for more information. Mrs. Ellsworth mentioned a name, a figure spoken of in hushed tones around town: David Keller, a man who lived on the outskirts of Brook Hollow, seemingly unremarkable to passers-by, but with a shadowed history of minor crimes and unsolved disappearances. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Keller was methodical, precise, patient, someone who could observe, infiltrate, and manipulate without leaving obvious traces. And now, Claire realized with a chill, he had chosen her. Determined to understand the extent of the threat, Claire pored through public records, old newspapers, and whispered stories. Keller's name appeared again and again. Minor criminal charges dismissed. Strange disappearances noted, but never solved. Neighbors recalling odd noises at night or fleeting glimpses of him near homes that had reported unusual occurrences. The town's quiet exterior had concealed a dangerous mind for years, and Claire had unwittingly stepped into his path. The tension escalated over the following nights. Claire documented every creak, every rustle, every shadow, until her journal had grown thick with evidence. But it was not just the physical disturbances that unnerved her. It was the psychological precision. Keller seemed to know her routines, her habits, the hours she slept, and the moments she was most vulnerable. The notes grew more personal. You should not have ignored me. I am closer than you think. Every sound you hear is mine. Claire's fear grew, but so did her determination. She began working with the local police more closely, sharing her footage, her journals, and every anomaly she had recorded. Officers began to take the intrusions seriously, and soon a task force was quietly observing the area. Cameras were set up across the abandoned lot, tracking movements at night, while plainclothes officers patrolled the neighborhood. Even with the authorities involved, the suspense remained. One night, Claire awoke to the faint glow of a flashlight moving across the porch. She froze, heart pounding. The intruder was there, just outside the window. She pressed herself against the wall, phone in hand, and waited. The light vanished almost immediately, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves. Through her footage, Claire finally saw him clearly. David Keller. A tall, silent figure, careful in his movements, almost blending with the shadows. His presence confirmed every suspicion, yet brought new fear. He had been watching her for days, possibly weeks, learning her routines, testing her reactions. The police began piecing together Keller's past. Evidence emerged from abandoned sheds, hidden compartments, and overlooked corners of Brook Hollow. Items linked to missing persons, detailed maps marking houses, and careful records of movements all indicated that Keller had been active for years, patient, unobserved, methodical. He had chosen Claire not at random, but as part of a pattern. A mind that thrived on psychological control, observation, and the slow unraveling of a victim's sense of security. Claire's nights grew longer, the psychological strain heavier. Every shadow became a potential threat, every sound amplified. Yet, alongside the fear, she developed a resilience. She learned to anticipate Keller's movements, to understand the signs before they manifested. Her journal entries became almost forensic in their detail. 11:02 p.m. Shadow moves near the oak tree. 11:27 p.m. Footsteps outside, soft but deliberate. 12:10 a.m. Light flickers in upstairs hallway. 1:05 a.m. Rustling near porch. No physical trace left behind. Neighbors noticed her vigilance. Some expressed concern, others curiosity, and a few offered cryptic advice. Some things are better left unseen, they whispered. Claire, however, knew she could not leave it. Understanding the intruder, documenting every anomaly, and working with the authorities were her only means of survival. Then, the investigation yielded its first breakthrough. A camera in the abandoned lot captured Keller's figure moving deliberately, crouched low, avoiding obvious sightlines. Motion sensors confirmed patterns. He had been monitoring her, observing routines, testing vulnerabilities. The police, now fully aware of the risk, prepared a more deliberate intervention. One evening, Claire returned from a brief trip into town to find her front door slightly ajar, not unlocked, but moved. Her heart raced. Inside, subtle disturbances confirmed the intruder had been there. A chair shifted, a drawer slightly open, and a small folded note resting on the kitchen counter. It read, "Soon." The message was brief, chilling in its simplicity. Keller's patience had limits, and now his escalation was clear. Claire realized with a mix of fear and resolve that the next step would define the trajectory of this ordeal. She had to be ready. With each night, each note, and each shadow, Claire became more of a detective in her own home. She mapped Keller's likely movements, tracked environmental cues, and coordinated carefully with the authorities. The suspense was suffocating, yet Claire's resolve strengthened. She could feel the culmination approaching, a confrontation that would test her courage, her wit, and her understanding of the unseen menace in Brook Hollow. Narrator, soft pause. And so, Claire moved closer to the truth. The patterns were clear, the intruder identified. David Keller was patient, meticulous, and dangerous, but he was no longer invisible. The game he had begun would soon reach a decisive moment. The nights, the shadows, the whispered notes, they had all led to this. In the next part of our story, the suspense reaches its peak. Claire will confront the danger directly, and the calculated, patient predator will reveal himself in ways that will test every ounce of her courage. The climax, the chase, and the confrontation with Keller are just ahead. The weeks of observation, documentation, and subtle terror had brought Claire to a critical point. David Keller was no longer a distant shadow. He had revealed himself in the most deliberate of ways, leaving notes, footprints, and patterns. The psychological strain was heavy, but Claire's vigilance had sharpened. She knew the stakes. The next encounter would not be accidental. It would be deliberate. The police had mapped Keller's likely movements and patterns based on Claire's observations and the surveillance footage. A team of officers was stationed discreetly around her house and the abandoned lot, ready to intervene if he escalated further. Claire herself had fortified her home as much as possible. Locks checked, cameras in every corner, and flashlights strategically placed. It was a night thick with tension. Rain drizzled gently against the roof, dripping from the eaves in soft, deliberate taps. The wind whispered through the old oak tree in the yard, casting moving shadows across the walls. Claire sat in her living room, notebook in hand, reviewing her journal entries, noting patterns, and preparing mentally for what might come. At precisely 11:42 p.m., movement flickered across the porch camera. A tall, dark figure crouched low, moving silently. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Keller was here. She did not panic. She had rehearsed this, mentally prepared herself. She reached for the phone to alert the nearest officer and whispered softly to herself, "Stay calm. Observe. Record." The figure paused, seemingly sensing something, then moved along the side of the house. Claire's camera caught the glint of eyes in the faint light, a cold, calculated awareness. Keller was deliberate, precise, almost surgical in his movements. He did not make a sound, and yet the tension in the room was suffocating. Claire's mind raced. She recalled every note, every shadow, every subtle warning. This was the culmination of weeks of observation, and now the predator was present, testing, probing, perhaps for the final act. The officers, positioned outside, were ready, but Claire knew she had to stay focused, to observe and not act impulsively. A soft creak from the front steps confirmed her suspicions. Keller was testing the door, moving closer, patient. The rain masked the sound of his movements, and the shadows hid his form. Every instinct screamed danger, yet Claire's careful observation allowed her to remain composed. Suddenly, a movement outside drew the attention of the officers. "Target sighted," one whispered into a radio. The chase began. Keller bolted, a shadow slipping through the rain-soaked lot, weaving between trees, ducking beneath low-hanging branches. Officers pursued, calling out in measured tones. The chase was deliberate, tense, almost surreal, like a predator and prey dancing a dangerous, calculated game. Inside, Claire felt both fear and anticipation. She knew Keller's knowledge of her routines made him dangerous, but she also understood that patience and observation were her greatest tools. She continued to monitor his movements through her cameras, calling updates to the task force. The chase wove through the abandoned lot, around the old fence, past the broken swing set, and toward the small creek at the edge of the property. Keller's movements were careful yet deliberate, calculated to test the limits of pursuit. Officers followed, keeping a safe distance, their radios crackling with instructions. At one point, Keller paused, crouched low, scanning the surroundings. The rain fell steadily, masking subtle sounds. Claire's pulse raced as she watched the shadowed figure, realizing that this man had planned for every contingency. But even the most meticulous plans falter under careful observation and determination. The officers moved in, closing the perimeter. Keller's options dwindled. He bolted toward a narrow path through the trees, only to find himself cornered. With nowhere left to escape, he stopped, breath visible in the cold night air, eyes cold and calculating. The officers approached slowly, their voices calm but commanding. "David Keller, step away from the path." A flicker of frustration crossed his face. He had been patient, meticulous, precise. But the careful, deliberate preparation of the authorities, combined with Claire's meticulous documentation, had cornered him. For a moment, the tension was almost unbearable. A quiet storm of anticipation, fear, and control. Then surrender. Keller raised his hands, slow, deliberate, acknowledging the culmination of his own methodical plans being undone. Officers restrained him, careful, professional, and deliberate. Claire, still watching from the house, felt a mixture of relief and lingering tension. The danger had been contained, but the psychological weight remained. The evidence recovered from Keller's hideouts confirmed the meticulous nature of his activities. Stolen items from past victims, detailed maps of homes he had monitored, journals chronicling patterns and routines. The authorities finally understood the extent of the danger Claire had endured, and the quiet town of Brook Hollow began to process a hidden history that had remained invisible for years. Inside, Claire finally allowed herself to exhale. The weeks of observation, journal entries, and careful surveillance had paid off. She had survived. She had documented the threat, and she had contributed directly to stopping a patient, calculated predator. Yet even in relief, the shadows lingered. Claire understood now that danger is not always loud or violent. Sometimes it whispers, hides in plain sight, and tests patience over time. The calm she had sought in Brook Hollow was forever altered, but she had endured. She had observed, and she had survived, stronger and wiser for the trials she had faced. In the next part of our story, we will explore the aftermath, Claire's psychological recovery, the town's response, and the lessons learned from her ordeal. The resolution is gentle yet reflective, allowing for a slow, soothing conclusion to the suspense that has gripped her nights. The weeks after David Keller's arrest were filled with quiet, almost imperceptible tension. Brook Hollow seemed to return to its usual rhythm, the streets calm, the shops humming with activity, children playing in the parks. Yet for those who had glimpsed the hidden shadows of the town, nothing was truly the same. Claire had survived, but the experience had left marks deeper than any physical trace. Her home, once a sanctuary of warmth and peace, had transformed into a place of careful observation. Claire took her time reclaiming it. She reorganized rooms, cleared surfaces, repositioned furniture, and removed the subtle traces Keller had left behind. But no matter how thoroughly she restored her house, she could not erase the psychological imprint. The awareness of vulnerability lingered, a quiet hum in her mind, a constant whisper of caution. Claire's journal became more than a log of disturbances. It evolved into a chronicle of survival, reflection, and understanding. She wrote long entries about each night, each shadow, each note, and every subtle sign of intrusion. She reflected on her fear, her courage, and the ways she had adapted to survive the patient, meticulous threat that had entered her life. The journal became a tool, not just for documenting events, but for processing the trauma and reclaiming a sense of control. Neighbors began noticing the change in her demeanor. Claire's walks through the town were deliberate, cautious, yet confident. She greeted familiar faces with warmth, yet kept her distance from those she did not know well. Conversations with residents revealed hints of concern and curiosity, some sharing their own experiences, others offering gentle warnings. Brook Hollow, in its quiet way, was healing, but the town would forever carry the memory of the shadow that had crept among its streets. Claire also began to understand the broader pattern of Keller's behavior. The authorities shared details of his past: minor crimes, disappearances, careful surveillance of previous victims. Keller had been patient, meticulous, and calculated, a predator who thrived on observation and manipulation. Claire realized that her own experience was part of a larger web of threats that had gone unnoticed for years. The understanding was sobering, but it also reinforced the value of her vigilance and resilience. In the months following the arrest, Claire developed a routine to restore a sense of normalcy. She rose early to walk the quiet streets, noting the subtle details of her environment, reconnecting with neighbors, and enjoying moments of ordinary life. She prepared meals slowly, tended to her garden, and allowed herself small pleasures: sunlight on her face, the sound of birds, the gentle hum of Brook Hollow waking in the morning. These routines grounded her, helping to rebuild a sense of safety and control that had been challenged by weeks of psychological tension. Evenings, however, remained a delicate balance. The memories of shadows, footsteps, and whispered notes lingered in the corners of her mind. She learned to acknowledge them without allowing fear to dominate her thoughts. Claire would sit quietly on her porch, sipping tea, observing the gentle sway of the trees, the subtle glow of the streetlights. The shadows were no longer threats. They were reminders of her resilience, of the awareness and courage that had seen her through the ordeal. Claire's reflections extended to the broader lesson of the experience. She realized that danger is often subtle, patient, and unseen. It can infiltrate the most peaceful environments, testing vigilance, courage, and resilience. Survival, she understood, was not merely about escaping harm. It was about observing, documenting, understanding, and responding with calm determination. Brook Hollow itself adapted to the memory of Keller's presence. The abandoned lot became a place of caution rather than curiosity. Residents installed extra lights, secured doors, and watched quietly, aware that even a seemingly peaceful town could conceal shadows. Yet life continued, blending normalcy with vigilance, as the community learned from the subtle terror that had unfolded in its midst. Claire found solace in the journal that had chronicled her nights of fear and observation. She revisited entries regularly, noting the growth in her resilience, the development of careful routines, and the insights gained from each night of suspense. The journal became a testament to her strength, a record of survival, and a guide for anyone who might face subtle threats in their own lives. One particularly quiet night, Claire reflected on the journey she had endured. The house was still, the rain a soft murmur on the roof, the wind a gentle whisper in the trees. She realized that while the shadow of fear would never completely disappear, she had learned to coexist with it, to acknowledge it without allowing it to dominate. Courage, she understood, often whispers rather than shouts. It is patient, observant, and persistent, like the quiet strength she had discovered within herself. The final notes of the story are simple, yet profound. Life continues, shadows linger, but resilience remains. Claire had survived the calculated threat of David Keller, had documented his meticulous intrusions, and had emerged wiser, stronger, and more aware. Brook Hollow would heal, but the memory of the patient, deliberate menace would remain a quiet reminder of vigilance and courage. And so, the story closes not with chaos or fear, but with reflection, awareness, and quiet strength. The shadows of Brook Hollow remain. The night carries whispers of past events, and the wind through the trees reminds us that the world is never as simple as it seems. Claire sits on her porch, sipping tea, feeling the gentle rhythm of the night. She breathes deeply, aware of the lessons learned, vigilance, resilience, and the subtle, persistent courage that carried her through the darkness. The world is calm again, yet enriched with awareness. The story is complete, yet its echoes linger softly in the quiet spaces, an enduring reminder that even in peace, we must remain aware, patient, and brave.